I shared with you that I've spent my career in Ohio as an educator, and at my entry point, when I first stepped into the classroom, we weren't really talking about educational measures. Really, and this might be a good time for me to disclose, I'm a former high school English teacher. And folks oftentimes look at my title and say, now let me connect the dots here. You're now the Managing Director of Strategic Measures, and you talk about data all day. And folks, you know, their first instinct is to kind of ask me where it all went wrong for me, because I was on this total humanities side. But really, it's not my love for numbers as much as it's my love for making a difference with children and believing that if we're going to do that, we need to measure and pay attention to our practices and how we can get better. But when I started in education, I was in the classroom, and I can remember this. I was in the classroom at South Point Local Schools when the first proficiency tests were introduced in the state of Ohio. And I remember that because they landed at grades 4, 6, and 8, 9 at that time. And I remember thinking as a teacher, I was so glad that I wasn't in those grade levels. I mean, how scary that was to me as a teacher. And shortly thereafter, there was this real kind of buzz in the state around those assessments being at grades 4, 6, and 9 in the state of Ohio. So it was a scary time. It was change. Those measures really introduced to us in education, these first measures, if you will, of achievement. And that truly was the introduction to educational measures for so many educators like myself. And value-added brought in a change in thinking in educational measures. It brought another piece of information to the table. And we still have a lot of work to do in Ohio with our teachers, our educators, our community, our parents, really understanding this paradigm shift of measuring not only achievement, but also measuring progress as a means to which we can really understand the effect of schooling and the effect we're making, these cause and effect relationships, if you will. So that's a higher level, but I get a lot of mileage of just kind of putting a visual up here and kind of talking through that. And most of us might understand what we would represent or call this bar of achievement, if you will. And so we might even identify and articulate academic content standards of what we want students to know, understand, and be able to do at a given point in time. And we might even measure that and have this bar of achievement, if you will, where we might identify where is a student in relationship to this articulated bar. And so you might even kind of reference that, and many educators might reference that as an Ohio achievement assessment. Where are students at a given point in time in relationship to this bar? And so then if we would plot out our measurement of where are students in relationship to this bar, and we could pull in and kind of plot that out, teachers in the classroom might refer to this snapshot as readiness. You know, these students come in with appropriate prerequisite skills and knowledge, and they're ready to learn at the grade level, so to speak. But in reality, we know that our classrooms, our schools, our districts, our state might look a little bit more like this, where we have students that are plotting out in different places in relationship to this bar of achievement, if you will. And so thus is the introduction of progress measures, is really taking another snapshot here, the snapshot of achievement, but then pulling that snapshot together, if you will, with other measures to really talk about the effect and really start to wrestle with this movement of children, if you will, from point A to point B. Now, when I have this conversation with teachers, I usually kind of position it as you know, take the evaluation system, accountability, and just set it over here for a minute. And let's think about why we became educators. And just jot that down for a minute on a Post-it note. And most teachers will say something to the effect that I became a teacher because I want to make a difference in the life of a child. To date, I haven't had a teacher say, I became a teacher to help a child pass a test. That's rarely what someone will say. But what really resonates with teachers is they want to make a difference with kids. And so that's the entry point to value-added, because what value-added is doing is really looking at the difference we're making with children from point A to point B. So to reiterate what Jim said, is really talking about this bar of achievement is a snapshot of a point in time. So that might be answering a question for us as far as, here's an assessment, where is a child in relationship to our 4th grade standards in math at a given point in time. And so that might be data that comes at us with this point of achievement. What progress measures like value-added do is actually take into account where kids start, a point A, if you will, as I have it plotted out, and it's measuring where kids go. And so this is an entry point for some educators that is a paradigm shift. And I oftentimes talk about this idea that value added really is looking at point A to point B. And to personify the term, value added isn't measuring or doesn't care whether or not students are passing this test. What value added is doing is looking at the measurement from point A to point B. So achievement measures are looking at performance on the test. Value added is really taking into account where kids are from point A to point B. So let's play that out a little bit and just look at the visualization here. We can see movement of a child that's quite a bit from point A to point B, and the child may not pass the assessment, but those signals of what's working with this child is really important to identify what's working so we can replicate that in different places in our schools to really identify what's working. By the same notion, these arrows can go in a different direction, right? Students can actually lose placement in the distribution of scores. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. But this is really the entry point for understanding what value added is trying to do here. Is what value are we adding to children? And it really calls out this question of this age-old paradigm of really talking about teaching and learning. And talking about teaching a child something that he or she does not already know when they step into the classroom. So what value are you adding on top of what the child knows when they walk into the classroom? So in this particular illustration, really hoping to illustrate that we have many students in the state of Ohio who can pass our state test the first day of school, right? Before we even administer a single lesson, they can pass that assessment. So it's really looking at all students and how we can move them from point A to point B. So let's take a look at this from another perspective, perhaps a policy perspective or an accountability perspective, and why measuring growth alongside achievement is really important. So let's take that bar of achievement and let's just play it out here as far as proficient on our state assessments go. And let's look at the journey of Jacob through Ohio schools, and let's look at the journey of a student, for example, a student whose journey might look something like Adam's in Ohio schools. And across the bottom, you can see this journey through grades 3 through 8. And as we plot out Jacob's journey of progress or growth from grade 4, 5, 6, 7, we can see that Jacob has always passed our state assessments. Okay? Jacob has always received a score of proficient or higher. On the other hand, a student like Adam, who's made continual progress, has not ever passed a state assessment. So in systems that only measure achievement, or the single measure, the single lens, if you will, of achievement, we might regard Adam, his schools, his teachers, his educators, as ineffective. And likewise, we might regard Jacob, his teachers, his schools, his district, as ineffective. So I'm not to suggest that one is more important than the other, achievement or progress, but progress can really help us to identify what's working. Because the harm in labeling Adam's school as highly ineffective is they might undo the very practices that are helping them get the progress and the gains. And likewise, Adam's school may go to Jacob's school to identify what's working to replicate and implement those practices. So it's important that we look at this from two lenses, two perspectives, and combine those measures to inform our work with students in the classroom and beyond. So a lot of numbers here on this slide, and we'll talk a little bit about dosage of value-added information, and many times it's often, guided right to the audience. But for this sake, there are a lot of information I'm going to share with you this morning that's not requisite for understanding value-added, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the questions you might be hearing in the state around questions around value-added measurement. And we get this question a lot, around why is this so complicated? Why can't we make this simple as far as just taking a child's test score and measuring growth from the movement of a test score? So what you're seeing here is actually scaled scores. We refer to them as those 3-digit scaled scores that'll show up on a student's OAA, would also show up on a report that a parent would receive from the school. And so this is just the data from last spring, from May 2013, and this represents the range of a scaled score. So just to get your bearings a little bit here, these are the grade levels for 3 through 8 math on the Ohio Achievement Assessments. And here, this, for example, 240 represents the floor of that test, and the 521 would represent the ceiling. Now I know this from working with parents and teachers in the state of Ohio. I would oftentimes get parents who hold on to these score reports of their children. And they'll come in and say, you know what, I want to understand why my child is not making growth from point A to point B, because I'm watching these scaled scores and they're dropping a little bit. And so in this system, the way we've designed our OAAs, and psychometricians would talk about this in the terms of the scale is not a vertical scale. But we'll kind of roll this in and give you an idea here of this bar. This represents the bar of passing or proficient on all of our state tests. So if we look at 3 through 8, proficient in math. But let's examine this and dig into this a little bit more from what a teacher or a parent might be seeing on a child's math scores that gets at home, and might even filter some questions back to you. First of all, if I believe that I can measure growth by looking at a scaled score, I'll just show you a couple of things. Just take a look at 7th grade math. And this 574 right here would represent the ceiling of the test. That would be the maximum. In other words, every question correct. And so if I'm using that to try to measure growth, and I follow that into the child's 8th grade year, you can see why that would be faulty logic. That would kind of fall apart on me, so to speak, because the scale changes. The ceiling of that test is different. And that's why it's not as simple as just tracking the growth of the scale from point A to point B. We'll also hear some talk around, well, I think I can measure growth or the impact I'm making for students by really tracking the difference of these levels that students fall in. These are the assigned performance levels associated with the child's performance on a state test. So some teachers or educators might actually take groups of kids and say, well, I had 20% in the basic and I reduced that to 10%. So they're trying to very innately or very intuitively, they want to measure the difference they're making with children, and they try to do that through these performance levels. And again, sometimes this bit of faulty logic causes people to not trust the model, because when it doesn't play out for them, they come to the conclusion that the model must be broken or flawed in some way, because the rationale might be I had all of these kids at proficient and I moved them all to accelerated, so that's growth. And let me just talk you through why it won't work out just quite that way. If you look at these 3 levels here, and this is actual data from May of 2013, and just look at the range. Look at the spread of a low-end proficient to a high-end proficient. You see that right here, 5th grade? So there's 23 scaled score points. That separates a child who just barely passed a 5th grade math test to a child who's at this next level on accelerated. Okay? So we see there's 23 scaled score points there. Even if you look at the range here, a low-end proficient to nearly advanced or highest end, you can even see there are 39 scaled score points that separate a child who passed the test at the lowest bar to being at the highest performing level. Now, if we're tracking and trying to monitor progress through these performance labels or levels, here's where it might fall apart on us. Because just look at the advanced level alone, and look at the point spread in the advanced level. You see that? So we said we have 38 points here, we have over 100 points here. And this really suggests to us that label of advanced, where people feel like advanced, or they think that's a child who's working above grade level, and perhaps can I get growth for a kid who's working at the advanced level? Well, we can see there's more academic difference between the needs of a child who's working at the low advanced level and the high advanced level than there are between these 3 levels put all together in the middle. So there's more stretch on the tails, if you will, of the advanced and the limited. There's a bigger difference there because there's a wider point spread. So for teachers and educators and principals and parents to understand, there's certainly room for growth at that advanced level. Also, just another piece that we talk to educators a lot about is this level of advanced. Sounds like to some folks that that's working perhaps above grade level. And on our State Board of Education approved, actually we look at a test blueprint. We know that a test blueprint articulates our OAAs, our state achievement assessments, to measure grade level skills and knowledge. And it's not measuring above grade level skills and knowledge. So when a child actually scores advanced on a state assessment, they're actually getting more questions correct on the grade level content, knowledge, and skills. So really tracking progress and growth through that is really important as we look at that. So that might be a deeper dive, but what I wanted to do is dispel a little bit of the myths around some of the things you might hear around how people might be trying to measure progress, apply, looking at the scaled score. You can't do that. So we needed it. It's kind of illustrating the need for a model that helps us measure growth from one school year to the next. Let me pause right there and just kind of give you some think time around this difference between achievement and progress and this paradigm shift of helping educators and our community members and parents understand these important measures before we get into some of the metrics around the model. Do you have any questions? Tom?
Okay, this may seem like an obvious question, but on the last slide that you showed, I was wondering why are the scale score ranges so unequal and they're quite spread over each level? I mean, why is that?
Well, for sure there's a psychometric answer to that, but I'll tell you from an educator's perspective as well. Working in the state when we had proficiency tests, and for many educators in the state this makes sense to them. Back in the day when we had 4th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade proficient, we did not have a common cut of 400 for passing on all the state tests. So when the data rolled in, folks from one year to the next didn't really know what is the bar for passing. And so when we switched from proficiency to achievement, having this common cut of a 400 for the passing rate was something that was really seen as the proficient is a 400. We can see that when we look at our data and our numbers. Now, there's also other complex reasons and why these scales are different from one year to the next, and it has to do with the cut scores and probably much more in-depth conversation than we want to have in this forum of talking about value added. But the psychometricians would actually refer to a scale where the vertical scale grows from one year to the next as something you intentionally designed to measure progress at the onset of that measure. And these measures were actually designed to measure achievement back in the early days. That's helpful too. Sure, yes, sir.
First of all, Jamie, thank you very much, and thanks for sharing your time and your experience with us. And thanks everybody that brought this idea forward. Having been associated with this district I was in since '02, the one question that doesn't go away for me anyway, particularly at the top and the bottom of the scale more than anywhere, is Sally Jones could be at the top, let's say, but actually because of a test, even though the test is to measure achievement as opposed to progress or the impact on teaching and learning, that if they don't quite grow that full year but they still stay in the top advanced, isn't that an indicator of success even if it becomes a 9-month growth instead of a year growth, particularly if they're successful in the classroom? Having said that, bear with me 1 second. So to me, there was achievement, there was progress, and there's somewhere in here about some kind of a look at the year and a continuum from a teacher's point of view about Johnny or Sally's progress. Not just based on that one day and that one test, and that never surfaces. I mean, since '02, for me, it's never surfaced. What am I missing?
Yeah, and let me get into the model a little bit more, because you're posing a really important question that I think we do as educators, we must wrestle with. And I think the question one of the questions I hear you posing is, how much growth? How much growth is enough growth? And that's an important question as we unfold this model a little bit more and talk about that. I'll share some of that in the stories.
I'm not trying to hold this up.
That's okay, as my experiences as well. Yes.
What if a student is rock bottom and she, I'm sorry. Yeah. So a student is rock bottom, the lowest you can get, but progresses dramatically but doesn't achieve. Does value added still count?
Does it count? I think.
Well, in the grades and all that other stuff.
Yes. To answer your question. And let's work through and let me show you a little bit more about the model, because I think some of this will be good information for us as we go through this. we're going to talk a little bit about the model in Ohio that's actually produced and generated by SAS EVAAS. In this particular model we're going to talk about, SAS refers to it as the MRM, the multivariate response model. We refer to it a lot as the mean gain model. And I think that's a good way to kind of think about that in the mean gain, because the title itself suggests a couple of things that will help you understand it. The mean, which is really talking about the average growth of a group of students. So let's hold on to that thought just for a minute and walk through this. We're going to talk about the value-added model in Ohio that is used to generate value-added reporting in grades 4 through 8 reading and math. Okay, just for the sake of time, we're going to pare that back and talk about these reports that are actually used in our accountability systems and actually used in 4 through 8 reading and math and generated through the assessment from an Ohio Achievement Assessment. So actually we're using grades 3 through 8 because 3rd grade is actually the baseline year for reports that actually generate 4th grade reading and math. So I'll give you a definition here at a very high level, a conceptual level, then I'll show you some visuals that might help you a little bit more. A couple of things that are really important that will help you even address questions that you might be hearing in the field is keeping in mind it's a mean gain. It is the average growth of a group of students. So when you're talking about the group, the effect that a teacher, a school, a district has on a group of students is really important in this model. So it's the average growth of students in the most recent year compared to the average growth of students in the 2010 state baseline year. Now, just for the sake of time, I'll explain this need to compare growth back to where we were in the state in 2010. And that's the statistical question here. How much growth are we making compared to kinds of growth we had back in 2010? Because you have to wrestle with how much growth is enough growth, and what are we looking at, and what are we measuring growth relative to? And you'll hear people talking about 1 year's growth. And that's even an interesting term to talk about 1 year's growth. How much growth is sufficient or expected in a year? And how do we wrestle with that from a statistical perspective of putting out there what is the standard or the expectation of growth in a typical year of schooling? So in these kinds of models where you're comparing back to a baseline of the state's year in 2010, that's really important because if growth is compared kind of relative to a pool, if you will, it kind of sorts that growth, if you will, to highs and lows. And what happens in an accountability system that compares growth back to a norming year is it enables all teachers, schools, and districts to achieve the growth standard. So you're comparing back to another year, another point in time, rather than comparing growth within year. So hold on to that thought and I'll explain that just a little bit more. The growth expectation, and when I talk to superintendents or principals in the state of Ohio, this is the first question I always ask them as kind of a filter. Is your staff ready to use value-added reporting? Just talk to them about what is the expectation for growth? What is that term of what is it we're looking for and we're measuring growth? If you're talking about that at a classroom level, a school level, a district level, and you kind of wrestle with their ability to answer that. And one of the things I would want a teacher, a principal, an organization to be able to articulate is from a statistical perspective here. We're asking that a student maintain placement in the distribution. If you want to call that 1 year's growth, or if you want to call it the growth standard as it's referred to in these reports, maintain placement in the distribution of scores. And that's an important piece. So we're going to talk about what that looks like from a perspective of a child who might come in very low, a child who might come in very high, and talk about what do we mean by the placement of distribution of scores. Maintain placement. So let's hold on to that, and let's talk about this a little bit just to unravel where this all comes from. So a student takes a test, and you'll hear this a lot, this one test, 1 day kind of information you'll hear in the field. But I'll tell you that this is actually derived from multiple tests and all of the students' history. All of the students' historical testing history is used in the model. Okay, so when we come into this, if you're looking at a typical 4th grader, student might take the test, and to a teacher, this really resonates with teachers, this idea of a raw score. How many points did the child get correct on this test? That's one of the things the teacher wants to know. So it might be 52 points possible, and where did the student land in this range? those raw scores are then converted to these 3-digit scaled scores. That's what I showed you on the math slide before. So points possible, those get converted to get us on a common scale so that 400 can be a common pass because of these raw points are all very different. We'll try to keep this as simple as possible. But you can see on that math chart, which is why I put it up there, that those ranges were all different. So we have to get those on a common scale. So then the statisticians convert these 3-digit scaled scores into this rank order, if you will, of a distribution of scores. Now teachers might refer to this, and this would resonate with teachers and educators, they might talk about this rank distribution of scores. In other words, the low score to the high score. Teachers might talk about that as a percentile rank. And parents may even know a little bit about a percentile. So when you say that a student scored in the 60th percentile, you're actually saying that they outscored 60% of the students in the state of Ohio. So in this particular model, we've converted, SAS has converted percentile ranks to NCEs, and I'll talk about that at a very high level for those folks who might know a little bit about percentiles and NCEs, but again, not requisite for understanding this model. So think about raw score, scaled score, and then you rank those from high to low. Okay, so student performance, and 1 being 1% and the 99 being the 99%. And this is the percent of students that you outscored in the state of Ohio. So this is the conversion that goes on. When we talk about value-added modeling in Ohio, we're talking about a student's performance somewhere on this range. And that's what we mean by maintain placement in the distribution of scores. 1 to 99. So think about the percent of students. Okay? So let's play this out and talk about what happens comparing this growth back to 2010. In 2010, we might have this 3-digit scaled score, if you will, and we might rank order that from the bottom to the top. And then we would rank this distribution into these NCEs for how they match up, a conversion table, if you will, for how these 3-digit scaled scores back in 2010 converge. And that's what's going on at a very simplistic conceptual level in this model, is there's a conversion. So we're talking about this rank order of distribution of scores. And this NCE, statisticians refer to this as a normal curve equivalent. It's actually very common in educational statistical measures, or when you're comparing big groups of numbers or averaging these performances. We can convert from a percentile rank to an NCE. Percentile ranks and NCE are similar in that they match up around the 50th percentile. So a 50th NCE would mean you're outscoring, on average, half the kids in the state of Ohio. So it would put you right in the middle. If you're at the 50th NCE, you're outscoring half of the students in the state of Ohio at your grade level. Right? So that's the commonality there. I'm going to skip over this one. So let's hold on to that idea. I needed to explain this 1 to 99. So when teachers log in to the EVAAS value-added system, they're going to see numbers somewhere in the range of 1 to 99. They don't see scaled scores, they're not seeing raw scores, they're seeing these numbers of where kids rank in the distribution of scores in Ohio. And this is some terminology that parents can even see when they log into the online public reporting site. They can start to see things like baselines and observed. And so I'll talk to you about this as a high level. What a baseline score is, it's a group of students prior year mean NCE. So we'll talk through that. It's a group of students prior year, so where were these 4th graders in the distribution of scores in the state of Ohio? So this might be a certain school district, a certain school. Here's their 4th graders, and they have a 47 NCE. And what that means is the 4th graders in that school are on average outperforming 47% of the students in the state of Ohio. Okay? So that's the baseline year. What the model is doing is looking at the difference we're making between where kids came into us and where we took them. Where was that NCE when they started, and where did they go? It's really important to understand the group. So let's play this out. Think about this from a teacher's perspective, and I've certainly had a lot of these days myself in the classroom right here in Ohio. So I might be a 4th grade teacher in the state of Ohio, and the students come into my classroom, and I might have a student come in, and that student, after a couple of weeks, I can run some diagnostic assessments, run some measures, and kind of figure out where is this student. And I might start to realize this student is at the 20th NCE. To your point, this student might be a very low-performing, low-achieving student in that they're coming into my classroom at the 20th NCE. Now, in this particular model, what we refer to as the growth standard, and it's important to understand it's a very conservative model. So then we go back to that original question, what are we asking? What is the expectation of growth? That would be that, how much growth is enough growth? That question we must wrestle with here. How much growth is enough growth? So as a teacher, and the question for the principal even is the teacher comes in and says, how am I supposed to move this child? Now if the teacher is confused about value added, and the teacher's thinking, this expectation, your evaluation is to have this child pass the test, certainly a worthy, noble goal to have this child achieving. But what we're looking at in value added is let's go into this child's end of the 5th grade year. When I said we want teachers and principals to be able to answer that question, what is it we want for the 20th NCE kid? In this particular value added model, the base of the growth standard is quite conservative when you think about the child at the 20th NCE. Because what was that definition? Maintain placement in the distribution of scores. And I share this with you, and for this purpose of this example, to help you understand at a very fundamental level what this model is doing, is looking at the difference between the baseline and the observed. Where did they start? Where did they go? With the mathematical difference of they started at the 20th NCE, they went to the 20th, and the mathematical growth standard is 0. The difference between where they started, where you took them 1 year in that distribution. Now, this is where the piece comes in of why it's really important to understand this model, because if you think about other students as this mean gain, if you will, it's about the mean of the group. All of the students this teacher might work with. So here's another student in the classroom might come in at the 55th. That student might go to the 67th, yield a positive 12. So then you have another student coming in, very high at the 92nd NCE. Where did you take that student? That student may have gone to the 89. So we get a little hung up when we try to discuss value added at the individual student level, because it's really about the mean or the growth of a group of students as they come together in those averages. And so as we play that out and talk about that, what happens with value added is sometimes you will have a child who has, you know, a negative 20, and you might have another child who has a positive 20. And how those means play together are really important when you're looking at statistical means and averages and n sizes. To understand that value added is not about one single child at the classroom, but it's really the effect of the group, looking at the mean gain, if you will. So this is again just another visual of this conceptual model of how you might convert this scaled score to a mean. And what was the mean baseline of a group of students at the 4th grade, 5th grade, or at the school? And where did they go after a year of time? And what was the difference between where they started and where they went? Very fundamental, basic conceptual level. There's a lot more up under the hood of this model that builds in more reliability of what we're looking at here. But for the sake of time, that's just a fundamental understanding of the mean gain and really maintaining placement in the distribution, point A to point B. I'm going to open up and show you, we're going to take a look at an online report that a parent could access from a district and kind of show you some things. We'll turn the corner here about how you might use this information to get better. But I want to pause just a minute to see what questions you might have just about the fundamental basics of this model. Point A to point B, a group of students maintaining placement in the distribution of scores. Questions? So far, so good. Okay. So let's go and before I open this up and show you what the general public would see as they log in to the EVAAS system online, public access to reports, let's understand a little bit about the color coding of the system that you would see online in the reporting system. So as I kind of unveil this, first of all, the teachers and sometimes educators might associate these colors. They might even refer to them as a stoplight report, if you will. So you'll see in the yellow color-coded on the report I'm going to show you that it indicates that students are making about the same amount of progress as the state growth standard. That means, on average, students are typically maintaining their placement in the distribution of scores in the state of Ohio. All right? So that's what the yellow would represent on these reports. One layer layer up from that is students are making more progress. 1 year down, they're making a little less progress than the state growth standard. And then statisticians refer to these as kind of this tails, if you will, of the distribution. So I wanted to give you a high-level understanding, because I'm going to show you a report with these colors. So you'll hear people talk about value-added as green or red or yellow, and they're really talking about what they're seeing on this online public reporting system. So let's turn the corner. So we talked a lot about some stats, maybe even more information than you care to know, but let's talk about how this can inform our work and really be a driver of change and improvements for students in the classroom if we understand how to use it appropriately. So this is a report that you can access online. Lots of colors going off in here, and I particularly chose this one. This was a district that actually asked me to come in and work with them because they were seeing some inconsistencies in their numbers. And now, there's a lot of numbers here, and I'll talk you through some of this and what's most important to see. But at a very high level, you can look at this and think about dark green, good, dark red, what are we going to do about it? So you're really thinking about it from that high level, is thinking about really some room for improvement. So just to get your bearings a little bit of this, because this is what our general public can see in the state of Ohio when they log into this system to look at their district or their school. Over here, you'll see, kind of get your bearings on this, you see 2011, 2012, and 2013. So I can see a 3-year trend of this district's growth and the impact of moving kids from point A to point B from a 3-year perspective. And as I look across the top, I can see grade levels. So they take a 3rd grade OEA that informs the 1st, 4th grade value-added report. So I can see all the grade levels across 4 through 8. All right? So just keep in mind these color coding, if you will. Now, the top of the chart shows the value-added progress, or lack thereof, if you will. The bottom of the chart, in my opinion, is one of the most informative pieces of information that we really like to do a lot of coaching with principals and school leaders and teachers to help them understand a little bit of how to use these metrics to get better. So in this particular system, I want to point out a couple of things. This bottom row is their 3-year average. So if you just look at these top 3 years, we see some things that are real interesting in that the district has gone from dark green, light green here at grade 8 to red. So they're kind of jumping around all over the place. And I will see this often because I go into schools and stand in and talk right in front of teachers and principals about the model. And sometimes when they see this kind of fluctuation in their value-added gains, it causes them not to trust it. Because we don't understand why this is happening. And we haven't changed staff, we haven't changed teachers, but there's a really important piece of information in here for children. Down here at the bottom is where I always start with folks. And we talked about this average or the mean NCE of different groups of kids as they come through your school system. And we always start there. So I project this for the principals, and if you look down here, you can see the past 4 years in this district and the average mean NCE of a group of kids as they have come through this school system for the past 4 years. So then I might pose that question. Let's just kind of take a look at this and just to get their bearings, and I might say, find me the highest achieving group of kids you've had in this district in the past 4 years, just to kind of warm them up. And so let's do this for this particular example. And right here they are. For this particular district, here's how I work with this district. In 2011, your 7th graders were the highest achieving group of students you have had come through this district in the past 4 years. So really important information. When those kids come in the door, they are outperforming any group or cohort of kids you've had in the past 4 years. Here's the question for our educators in Ohio. Did you know that? Did you know that before the end of the year? So really building this awareness of kids. So what I tell them is, here they are as 7th graders. This was their mean NCE when they came in. And then in 2011, where did you take them in 2012? So that's what the model's doing. They started out at 57 and they went to a 55. So they lost 2 points in the placement of the distribution in the NCEs. And look at the difference here, the difference between those two. And if you follow that up, that's their negative red. Right? So then they get this aha moment. Well, here's where the dialogue typically goes. We don't understand how we went from green to red because we didn't change a thing. We didn't change our teachers, we didn't change our principals, we didn't change our textbooks, our resources. We did everything exactly the way we did the year before. And that, for me, as a presenter and as someone who shares and trains on value added, is what I call a beautiful moment. Because they just walked right through that. Because they said, we didn't change a thing, but who changed? The kids, right? And that's really the beauty of value added, is it's prompting us to pay attention. And the story got even better. Because then when they went back and talked to their teachers said, oh, but we didn't know. And again, that's a good day in education, because now we're prompting and creating a sense of urgency for teachers to really wrestle with those questions in their classroom. How is it that I can learn about where these kids are earlier in the school year? Because the time to find out you have the highest achieving group of kids you've ever had in your classroom is probably not at the end of the school year. But rather, it drives those practices of exactly what we want to do, those research-based practices of really diagnosing student needs as early in the school year as we can. So I've always said that it's hard to meet the needs of children if you do not know what they are. And so that's our common ground. And so this can really be a driver of this, because this story gets better for how this data can be used to help this district learn about some things. Because let's do that again. And this was just a district I walked into cold, and they said, we don't understand this. Because let's do it again. Find me your second highest group of high achieving kids. And you can see they're right here as fourth graders in 2012. They were at the 56 NCE. So again, they look very different than the fourth graders in 2011. The fourth graders in 2011 were sitting at a 50. The fourth graders in 2012 were sitting at a 56. So those kids came into fourth grade with academically different needs. So when you plot that out and you look at where you took them, that's the only other red on this district's chart. So here was their story as this unfolded working with this district. And if you'll look at this of where kids land in the 8th grade, for the past 3 years in this district, kids end at the 8th grade year right around the 55th NCE. So here was their story. If kids came in higher than the 55th NCE, they didn't get gains. If kids came in lower than the 55th NCE, they got gains. So here's what the story of value added that's been really interesting for me in my journey. And this is why I really embrace this model and what it can tell me as an educator, is to think about this value added exposes the difference between teaching 8th grade and teaching an 8th grader. What I mean by that is really understanding this 8th grader versus to go to my classroom and teach 8th grade exactly the way I taught it the year before. And so using this measure really probes on this, because here's where this district came full circle. Had they not had this data, they wouldn't have seen it. But one of the things they came to the conclusion is they're pushing these kids right here to this threshold of the 55, and it's like they stop. And one of the things the district came back and said, in reflection, it seems that we've gotten pretty good at helping kids pass tests. So they're jumping over the bar, we're bringing up the bottom. But how are we moving all kids from point A to point B? And so we really always share it, we tell for kids the importance of these two lenses, of looking at it from an achievement perspective, but also paying attention to growth, to really look at the cause and effect relationships of how you move children. So there's a lot of numbers here, for sure, and it takes a lot of work to help folks understand what they're looking at, and it takes a lot of time to really help people understand this model. But time and time again, once folks understand the model, I found it to be very empowering for direction of really what do we do next, and replicating what's working and really weeding out the things that aren't within the system. A couple of other things, I know this is getting a little bit kind of detailed, but I'm going to talk on just a couple of things because we hear this a lot and we wanted to address this with you. This idea of a perfect measure, if you will, a perfect educational measure that has precision in it, if you will. I'll just share my own story in education, is that I personally believe that value added is not the introduction of imperfect measures in education. I mean, as a former high school English teacher myself, I would tell you that there's probably no bigger high stakes measure in my own classroom than the measure I put on a child's feedback on their papers that I grade. To me, that's the highest stake measure in education, is the feedback I put on a paper of a child that I'm grading, and the measure that I put into my own grade book. And as a high school English teacher, I'll be the first to tell you that, and I have a student that's a freshman at the University of Cincinnati, and I know the power of the letter grades and the impact and the role that plays for college entrance and college acceptance. And so I see those as very high stakes measures. But were the measures that I put into my own grade book of the papers that I graded, I did the absolute best I could, but many times those were not perfect measures, if you will. And what's really important is that we talk about how we can combine measures and use measures together to give us signals and directions of how to improve our work, of really helping us to use these measurements within a system. In the SAS EVAAS methodology for value added, we first and foremost talk about that all measures of student learning contain error. And in this particular model, we do have what's called a standard error built in. And what a standard error is doing is really capturing the degree of certainty. So it's not about precision, but it's about how certain are we? How sure do we know? If we're going to make decisions around this information, what is our degree of certainty around this measurement? And so we have what we call a standard error built in. And in this system, because we're talking about averages, the standard error is influenced by two things. One is the n size, or the size of the group that you're measuring. So thinking about a classroom of 25 kids versus a school of 200 kids versus a district of 15,000 kids. So we talk about this standard error that helps us understand when we're averaging numbers and we have outliers in the performance. You have one score that may not be an accurate representation of where a kid is performing on a given day. And that one test score may not be an accurate, precise measure of what that student knows and understands and is able to do. So as we look at larger n sizes, and I oftentimes joke about this when I work with teachers, even in my own career, thinking about how we'll be very quick to talk about students whose test scores are artificially lower than what they perhaps are capturing. We don't often talk about in education students whose scores are artificially higher. You know what I mean? Like, what about the kid that had the good test day? Because we have those kids too, right? So I think we've all seen that before as a student who may have performed higher on a state assessment than what we may have predicted, or perhaps higher than what really is capturing. And that's the power of this mean, is really grabbing and looking at those averages and how a larger n size, many of the outliers end up compensating for themselves. Two things will increase the standard error. And I say this to you because this impacts a teacher's report, a school's report, and a district's report. So as we talk about, and this really are things that I think as a state board you'll wrestle with, and kind of thinking about how we do this, how we go down this road and inform policy, and continually revisiting what we know and how we can really inform how we talk about value added and use this information to improve education in our state. We go back to this growth standard, if you will, and we'll plot this out to kind of bring this full circle and talk about, let's just plot out growth, if you will, on this one. And let's say that in a year one estimate, let's say a teacher has an average of 1.5 in the growth, and that means on average, the NCEs of that group of students grew 1.5. That means she might have had a group of students at the 60th, and on average, she took that group to the 61.5, all right? So that would be growth in the system. So we plot that out. The next important statistical question that must be asked is, how sure are we? What is the degree of certainty we have? Because it's not a precise measure. You won't see the word precise or precision or exact on any EVAAS report. What you'll see is the word estimate. So we talk about value-added gains as far as an estimate or a range around a degree of certainty. And that answers many of the questions you'll hear sometimes that folks will say about how certain are we. And so this single dot, this 1.5, statisticians will tell you that the estimate is the most likely value. The most likely, when we talk about statistics here. And then we have this standard error, if you will, where we wrap around this degree of certainty. And this is absolutely going on in this modeling before we talk about the teacher effect or the school effect. We talk about how certain are we. And so then we talk about this performance as a range. And now we can see this range of the teacher's effect may have been as high as a +4, but may have been as low as a -1 when we wrap around the standard error. So we're talking about how sure are we? So the standard error, for an example here, would be a 2.5, and we talk about a standard error as a 1.5, give or take 2.5. How sure are you? So we're somewhere in that range of certainty. So this standard error and this red box here representing the standard error, the confidence intervals, is really talking about the degree of certainty. So let's play that out. Year 1, and let's play that out again here with a year 2 for the teacher's report. So here's a second year, and second year for some reason we may have a different level of a standard error for some reason. Maybe the in size got smaller, maybe the teacher's classroom was smaller, so we have a different layer of the standard error. Third year, and then here's where we can start to see some things when we look at a 3-year trend, and this is why in the accountability system, around the school and the district report, and at the teacher report, we're talking about this as a multi-year average. So as we talk about plotting this out, what happens when you look at a 3-year average is the n size here. This might be a teacher with 25 kids and 25 kids here and 25 kids in year 3. When you get into the multi-year, now we're talking about the cumulative effect. So instead of the 25 drawing up these large standard errors, now we're talking about this in terms of 75 kids, a cumulative, and what happens is the standard error gets smaller. And what's happening that we're talking about here is the degree of certainty is higher, so the standard error shrinks. So you'll see this difference play out with the more data you have, the more certainty you have. All right? So as you get that cumulative effect in the 3-year, multi-year average. I'm going to show you a little bit, this growth index, and just for the sake of simplicity, I'll show you a little bit here. This is what a principal and a superintendent or someone with these kinds of access at the district level would see in a teacher's value-added report. And this is actually the top of a teacher value-added report. And you'll see, this is kind of the walk or the journey we've taken this morning to let you see this. So this is 2011, 2012, and a teacher's 2-year average. And you'll see these 3 words across the top, and this is why I kind of had to go down that road of explaining that to you at a high level. You see the estimate, and this is the difference between the NCEs of where a group of students that a teacher taught, where they started, where they went. So this is the difference in that NCE. This is the standard error associated with it. So we want to talk about how sure are we? How certain, if we're going to make decisions around this for a teacher, for a school, for a district, what's our degree of certainty? And because different teachers and schools and districts will absolutely have different levels of certainty based upon different standard errors, we have to kind of create this growth index, if you will, which really takes the standard error and has the standard error absorbed in that index, if you will, in that estimate. So it's looking at the standard error and pulling it into this estimate to create this index. So the index, right here, this is the number we use in both the accountability system for the school and the district and at the teacher level report, because it is the estimate that includes the actual standard error and the degree of certainty. And as we roll this out, then we see these performance levels. And so we can see here, in a particular sense here, in 2012, the teacher's NCE effect here from one year to the next was a negative 1.2. And in 2011, it was a 0.20. But the 2-year average puts it back into the positive as a 0.33. So you'll see these kinds of levels jump around a little bit, not only on the estimate, but also on the degree of certainty there within that model. These are a little bit different, a little bit hard to see in different projectors, but this is kind of the way the levels play out in the teacher level reporting. I kind of told you that middle level before when we looked at the district report. The middle level here is the teacher's index. That's the estimate gain and the degree of certainty. Equal to or greater than a -1, but less than a +1. So there's somewhere in the range, if 1 year we look at that growth standard is a 0, there's somewhere between a +1 and a -1. And that puts them right in that range. This label here at average is oftentimes very misunderstood. And really, when you look at this label of average, it really is intended to be about the mathematics of really the performance is equal to or greater than, that the students are making about the same amount of progress as the growth standard in the state of Ohio. So it's actually falling here. 1 degree above and below is actually talking about greater than 1 but less than 2. And out here, as we talk about this on the tails, is the teacher's effect is 2 standard errors outside of what the average performance of a teacher is in the state of Ohio. So if you look at this being average, the teachers on the tails and the schools on the tails and the districts on the tails of the distribution, and what we mean by that is up here in this area and down here at this area. If you look at this as even a 5-point scale, up here at the 5 and here is the 1, are 2 standard errors out, high degree of certainty that the performance is significantly different than the value-added gains or losses of others in the state of Ohio, with a high degree of statistical certainty. So I've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of stats and a lot of terminology, and this is how I often end the conversations that I have with teachers and principals. It's just a reminder, and as I started telling you that I'm a former high school English teacher, I've kind of gotten into this journey using data to kind of inform my work and to think about what difference am I making with children from point A to point B. And it's been a great journey for me, but really sitting at the table learning everything I can to really use measurement and data to inform my work. But I talk with teachers about it in this way. We ask about dosage. How much data and stats do we ask teachers and principals and educators and parents to know and understand? This is where I usually go back to, is kind of thinking about, well, first of all, I really have high regard for our teachers and our educators in the state. So I believe that dosage is absolutely appropriate for everything I just showed you. I really believe that our teachers and educators can understand this data and this information and how to use it to inform our work. But I also remind folks of what we ask children to do in the state of Ohio. So I just kind of go through this and talk about what's in Ohio's academic content standards for students. And at grade 1 in the state of Ohio, around our own standards, if we look at mathematics and statistical methods, at grade 1 in the state of Ohio, we are introducing to children these ideas of describing the likelihood of simple events as possible, impossible, more and less likely. So we're talking and introducing stats to first graders about the statistical likelihoods. At grade 6, we're asking our children in the state of Ohio to understand different information provided by measures of center. Our children in the classrooms are learning mean, mode, and median, and the measures of spread, the range. And that was that big chart, the range of the scores at grade 6 in Ohio. Grade 7, describe how the inclusion and exclusion of outliers performance really affect the overall mean of a group of scores. Grade 8, describe how the relative size of a sample, the N size, compared to the target population affects the validity of predictions, and explain the mean sensitivity to extremes. And that's really what we're talking about with standard errors and looking at these kinds of measures of what we're doing with children in Ohio's classrooms. In grade 10, really our standard for getting a diploma in the state of Ohio, interpreting the relationship between 2 variables using multiple graphical displays, and I put a lot of those in front of you today, and statistical measures, box and whisker plots. Those are those standard errors, those red lines, if you will, and measures of center and spread. So when you talk about dosage and how much is enough, I mean, certainly as I open, value-added could absolutely be a college course. But you can really take some information and spend an hour or 2 and help people to get some information about how might we measure the difference we're making with children from point A to point B for the purpose of really understanding the effects of our practices and the choices that we're making so that we can protect them and replicate them across Ohio schools to really learn from one another. And I'll share, to kind of drive this home a little bit more, my work and my love around value-added is certainly not about the numbers, but really working directly in Ohio schools with principals and teachers. I always start here, and some of those charts that we talked about have had the great pleasure of working side by side with many amazing superintendents in Ohio, and they'll look at the data and they'll say, again, we're wrestling with this, we're trying to understand it, and we always start at the systemic programs level. I mean, just recently I had a superintendent give me a call and say, we're seeing something in our data, we're not understanding this, but across all 4 of our middle schools, we are red in value added. And he was really wrestling with this, and he said, I'm having a hard time believing We have all of our ineffective teachers at grade 6. I'm not accepting that. There has to be some other reason for this. Can you come out and help us explore what this might be? And I think he was really onto something because he wanted to first start at the systemic level as a superintendent. We've got 4 middle schools. All 4 of them are value-added red. So we wanted to start with, perhaps it's curricular, perhaps it's our resources, perhaps it's our textbooks, perhaps it's some kind of professional learning that we are systemically providing all of these 6th grade math teachers. So I would really applaud him because what he did, and this really talking about action response, is number one, he decided this wasn't okay. That he really wanted to explore why the students in his district were not making the same amount of gains as the other students in 6th grade math. So he had this call to action, and he called his principals in, and here's what this system can do for Ohio schools that understand how to use the system. Went in and he brought the principals in and he gave them a charge, and he said, what I want you to do is go into this system, and I want you to find other middle schools that look just like yours. In other words, go in and find middle schools that have the same percent of kids on free and reduced lunch. Go find the same percent of kids that have the same percent, or schools of ESL students, students who do not speak the English language. Go in and find schools that have achievement levels, the same degree of kids passing tests as you have, but then find me schools like you who are making more progress. And then I want you to split up that list as 4 middle school principals, and I want you to interview them. Call them, talk to them, find out what they're doing differently. When they came back, now this was their story, it's not the answer to everybody's, but when they came back, they wholeheartedly agreed that they saw something that they were doing very, very differently, and across their middle schools, they were having less time for mathematics instruction than any of the other middle schools they talked to. Now again, it's just their story, but they had their data, they had their information, they had their story, they had their interviews, they went out to replicate a practice that was working in Ohio, they stood up to their Board of Education, and they were able to move that like flying colors because they had the rationale and the data for moving that along. So it was a great story, but it was really important what the superintendent did. He really wanted to start first with the structure, the services, the program, and the systems within that, and then tear it down to the classroom level and ask those questions around opportunities for professional learning. Then really at the classroom level, the very first entry point I go to is curricular alignment. Really important. Folks oftentimes talk about value-added data, and they immediately go to associating that with the teacher's instructional skills with how they teach. And I always say it may very well be an implication here of value-added numbers, but what's really important to first, and I talk about this as uncovering rocks and looking under them in your data, is to talk about what are you giving kids an opportunity to learn here. Access to content and the curricular skills and knowledge and understanding what I teach. Because I will tell you, this model, if we're not really aware of what we're measuring in the state of Ohio for the expectations of what we want students to know, understand, and be able to do, you can have teachers who are very strong at instruction who will look ineffective in this system because they're teaching X and we're measuring Y. So they may be highly effective at teaching the wrong things. So when you go in to observe practice as a principal, all kids may be on task, all kids may be engaged in having fun, but what is it that we're giving them access to learn? So it's really an important, you have to kind of look under those rocks and talk about these variables, if you will, that one school's value-added gain may be very different from another's. And then we get into assessment and classroom assessment. How are we measuring and monitoring student learning throughout the school year? And that driver of value-added data I showed you before was a perfect day because the principals went back to the teachers and they said, oh, if we had only known these were the highest achieving group of kids we've ever had. So it's a driver for really diagnostic testing earlier in the school year, diagnostic assessment, so we can understand the needs of children earlier on in the school year, so then we can get out front on it to impact that. Many researchers talk about that idea, this high-impact practice of these formative instructional practices in the classroom, using assessment to that end. And then we get to instruction for how I teach. So what I'm teaching children, how I'm responding to information in real time, and then how I go about responding to that data and information. So as I close, and we'll take any final questions from you, I just want to reiterate for sure the importance of combining educational measures to inform our practices and our work in Ohio, and that all measures of student learning contain error, and to recognize that no single measure can capture the true complexity of learning and teaching, and how we select measures and use those in combination. And I would submit both academic cognitive measures and non-cognitive measures that tell us about the learning experiences that children are having in our classrooms. And there's just an important distinction around this awareness of flawed assumptions around any kind of a measure versus a flawed measure. And one of my favorite authors, James Popham, really talks a lot about validity in the measurements and the instruments that we use, and really the difference between an invalid inference and an invalid measure, an invalid assumption and an invalid measure. And so it's really important that we have professional learning around what value added is, and just as important what it is not, and how we can use those measures to inform our work. So with that, we have a little bit of time for some questions and discussion.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to thank you for your presentation. That was absolutely marvelous. Before we go any further, I'd like to recognize Representative Becker was here earlier and joining us, and Representative Terhar is here. So thank you for being here. We're very appreciative that the legislature had the mind to come and join us. And Mr. Gunlock.
Thank you for your presentation.
Microphone.
I have one question, or two questions. First one, I've heard numerous teachers say, all my kids are accelerated. I can't get growth. And I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Thank you for asking that. And I'll put on my most recent experience working as an educator in Dublin City Schools. It was an interesting journey for me as well, very high achieving district. A couple of things, the terminology of accelerated and advanced in this system, and that was one of those where we talk about that you can move advanced kids actually quite far. One of the things, without sliding all the way back through, it's a misunderstanding. We talk about that range of a 1 to a 99 in the NCE. An NCE can actually go higher than a 99. And we talk about that as dosage, so when I get that question, that's absolutely when I give that extra dose and talk to people about that. And this was actually something I had to do with teachers in Dublin schools to kind of illustrate the point, because there was a belief that a 99 on the NCE was the maximum scaled score. So when the teachers got in the system and they saw a child with a 99, they thought, how do I grow this child? Because they're on the ceiling. And that's just something we've got more work to do, and we're actually working with the Ohio Association of Gifted Children, really try to help share this information about diagnostic measures to kind of making sure that we can move kids from point A to point B. But understanding that a 99 is the maximum you see in the EVAAS system, but really what's happening in that system, NCEs actually went up to about 132 last year in the state of Ohio. One of the things I did for teachers is really, we have this diagnostic information through the department's score report release. The schools can actually go online through their online reporting system, password protected, and they can get a report for frequency distribution of scores, and they can see the number of children in that district who are actually, quote, hitting the ceiling on a state test. And actually, in my experience, in the particular districts that I've worked for, fewer children hit the ceiling of a state test than they did on a national norm test. And that was news for people because they really thought there was more growth and I'll give you the example. We actually compared the analysis to, it was a Stanford achievement, which is actually written by Pearson, who also helps us with the development of the OAAs, that there were more students who had a maximum scaled score and hit the ceiling on a national norm reference test that we use to identify gifted children in the state of Ohio than there was on a state OAA. And the other piece that I submit is the state does have policy around what we call focus accelerated. And when I get that question about these kids are hitting the ceiling of a test on an OAA, you know, one of my bigger concerns is, what are we teaching them in the classroom? If they're sitting in the classroom, like 5th grade math, and they're getting a perfect score at the end of the year. So I think it's also a driver for really talking about differentiation and opportunities for focused acceleration where some students by state policy really can enroll into 6th grade math. As a 5th grader in their state coding system, they can be a 5th grader taking 6th grade math. So if hitting the ceiling of the test is a problem, I would almost suspect that what are we teaching them in the classroom might also be a problem. So to really get those systems aligned as options, and there are resources that might help them with that. Diagnostic measures that kind of help to see the high flyers, we certainly have them. We absolutely have them. Really getting the right placement in the classroom so that they can show growth is important. Go ahead.
This is a report card question. As you,
This might get deferred right here.
no, this is an opinion. We delayed, we don't have an overall grade for 2015. We know the overall grade in 2014. What is your opinion of an overall grade rather than doing it like we've been doing?
For value-added?
No, for the whole report card.
I probably am not in the position to have enough information about the pieces and parts to answer that. I think there's an opportunity with value-added itself to talk about the weights that the subgroups may have and carry. I think there's an opportunity, and again, as we talked about, I think what's important is to make the case that value-added can be a powerful driver. How we do that is a great discussion that we can have in the state of Ohio once we understand the capacity of what value-added can provide. I think there's a good conversation to be had there.
Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you. How does open enrollment affect the mean NCE of the school district?
For that one tonight. Those are, ODE business rules might impact some of those, and that would be your best.
Well, when you say how does open enrollment affect it, of course, students are going to another district or another school, well, another district in that case. And so remember that what we're doing is following the kid across time in terms of their scores. So they carry the scores that they've had with them, the history of that student with them to wherever they're going. So in one sense, open enrollment has no impact on value added other than the fact that there are a different set of kids who are in the pool of students who are being assessed for that value added for that grade, subject, and school. But otherwise, I don't think it really has any impact.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, so you're saying that these kids are basically, if they were at a 20, they'll still be at a 20. And if they're still at a 20,
Kathleen,
that's
could you hit
still,
your microphone?
there's still 1 year of growth.
Thank you.
So they might not, depending on what their peers are doing, they might not really be accomplishing very much at all. So
I think this is an important piece to understand about value added, and that's why I really mentioned it's a conservative model. And so when I first started working in data, it was kind of new for me too, and I actually played for a couple of years a role with the state support team where I traveled the state on behalf of the department and worked with schools in meeting AYP. And so you wrestle with this idea of closing achievement gaps. And if you'll think about that opening slide of kids working well below the bar and kids working above the bar, and then you talk about achievement gaps and the difference between where kids are. If you think about it, a child at the 20th NCE, and that's why we usually talk about these things in terms of a growth standard, and some folks call that 1 year's growth. If a child, and you think all children, let's just say that this might represent that rank order distribution of 1 to 99. And mathematically, if we talk about all children maintaining their placement in the distribution of scores, so if this is 2013, and we look at 2014, and we really think about this not even anything further than that growth expectation of maintain your placement in the distribution, what have we done for the achievement gap if all children maintain their placement in the distribution, right? Not one thing, because all kids are here and they go here. So I think that's what we're talking about is this idea of we know value added can tell us something very important, but how we move forward with our decisions and discussions around what this should look like. I think if you think about the 50th NCE and all children below it, really at the local level, folks who understand this we'll put a lot of emphasis on any child working below the 50th NCE must have more than 1 year's growth if we hope to close an achievement gap. So then we talk about the acceleration and the pace and the sense of urgency, because we know that a child at the 20th NCE is probably not college or career ready. And so really how you position that to think about accelerating growth and how you, those are the discussions I think going forward to really talk about the best ways to go about doing that. So I think if I'm answering your question correctly, I was intrigued because, and this is how I knew folks that didn't quite understand it when I would go out to school districts working with the state support team, and someone would say, our goal here is we want 1 year's growth for all children and we're going to close achievement gaps. And that's when I knew, oh, you need more than 1 year's growth for kids working below the 50th NCE if we're going to close the achievement gap. So, do I answer your
Yes,
question
thank you.
correctly?
Any other questions? Mr. Jones, do you have any questions? Mr. Collins?
Thank you. No, I'm gonna take it.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That was extraordinarily wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.